Hi everyone, my name is Ahmed Shaheen. I would like to thank you all for attending today's session. First of all, I would like to highlight our MIA service webcast series where we have more than one webcast available. You can visit this webcast series on the below. As you can see, these sessions with the dates where you can access any session that you would like to attend after this session. Now, let's go back to our main presentation. We will talk today about SQL Server Database Migration. Let me check that you can hear me well. Anyone can hear me? Okay, that's great. My name is Ahmed Shaheen. I'm a Microsoft Regional Consultant working at MIA HQ, Middle East region. My specialty is at application development. I'm an application development consultant. I have plus 11 years of experience and more than 8 years in SQL. And you can also use my tweet and blog account to check for any updates. Now, regarding our session today, we will start by overviewing the database migration and define what database migration means. In general, we need to look at two issues when considering a database migration. A database migration could be an upgrade from SQL Server version like SQL Server 2008 to SQL Server 2012, or it could be a different location like moving it from a server A to a server B, or maybe changing the storage and preparation. Our purpose of this presentation is to highlight the aspects that you need to consider during and before a migration. So what usually happens is that we underestimate the migration, and what happens is that you spend more time in planning or building a better plan for the migration, which will, in general sense, help you to estimate a better plan for you and move with your projects later on. What we will cover today in our presentation is the migration path. We will talk also about migration strategies, migration methods, and application reconfiguration that need to be done during a database migration. Also, we will look at the backups, VLDBs, migration tasks, workloads, and we will finish with some consideration that you might find it useful for you in your project with SQL database migration. We'll start the presentation with this diagram. Now, whenever you start a database migration, you need to discover the environment itself to look at what kind of environment you're working with. There could be an environment with several servers and multiple instances with different version each. So first of all, you need to know what kind of environment you're going to work with. One good tool I usually use for this such scenario is the map toolkit. It generates you a report where you could understand and see what kind of SQL Server versions you have. And then you can see the diagram. The most important thing for you is to start with a good discovery so that you're not surprised with what kind of servers you have and what kind of versions you have of SQL Server. Now next, you need to consider what we call a migration path. So if we take an example of SQL Server 2012, let's say what's the migration path possible for SQL Server 2012? In this section, we describe what's needed to be done in the previous version to be shifted directly or transferred directly to 2012. Now we have two approaches to do the migration. The first approach is what we call a direct upgrade, where you can have, for example, SQL 2005 or 2008. You can transfer it directly to SQL Server 2012 without having a stop in between. Now, if you consider older version like SQL 2000 or SQL 7, you might need first to upgrade it to SQL 2005, for example, then proceed with the prerequisite and go for SQL 2012. So you cannot go directly from SQL Server 2000 and to go directly for 2012, especially from the database perspective. Now, there are some other prerequisites that might be needed, such as, for example, if you consider SQL Server 2005, you need to have at least Service Pack 4 installed on that server. For SQL Server 2008 R2, you need to have SP1 installed. So these are what defines the migration path. It's the starting point and the end point and how you can achieve that goal. We need also to have a look at the migration strategies that we're going to follow. Now, regarding migration strategies, we have two strategies that are the general strategies or approaches that Microsoft considers. The first strategy is what we call an in-place upgrade. It means that we're using the same instance and the same server to do our upgrade. This is usually done using the same setup of the SQL Server. So, for example, if we're moving to 2012 and we have an instance or a server that hosts SQL 2008, what we do is that we bring that setup files on the same server and start setting it up using the same server and the same instance, where it has done the in-place upgrade on the same instance and on the same server. On a different perspective, we have what we call a side-by-side. A side-by-side will require one of two approaches. You can either use the same server but use a different instance. So, for example, if we have a 2008 instance and we want to upgrade it to 2005, what we usually do is we create a new instance for 2012. So you have two instances on the same server. Then you start moving your product to 2012. You will end up with two instances, but one server. On a different perspective, you might have multiple servers, like two servers, for example. You start with 2008 on a one server, and you end up with 2012 on the different server. For an in-place upgrade, as you can see in this drawing, this is just an explanation on, you started with the one server, with the one instance, and you end up with 2012 on that same instance. However, for the side-by-side, let's consider the first scenario, which is the one server scenario. You have that one server with one instance, and you will end up with two instances. You will have the previous instance or the old instance unchanged. It will stay on that server. However, you will end up with the new instance. The last scenario is the two servers, the side-by-side. What you have is that you start with the one single server. That's not going to change. What you're doing is that you create a new server with a new instance, and you start your migration to that server. So you end up with two servers. As a quick comparison for these two approaches, you will end up with this list. So before making a decision to go for a side-by-side or for an in-place upgrade, you need to visit this list. What you can highlight from this presentation is that there are some features that might be migrated manually and some features that can be migrated automatically. So, for example, if you consider the data transfer in the in-place upgrade, it's done automatically for you by the tool or by the widget. However, for the side-by-side upgrade, you need to do it manually. In addition, also the instance configuration. While you do the migration, the configuration are done by the setup itself automatically in the in-place upgrade, and they're not done automatically on the side-by-side. So before you pick up a method, you need to understand what you need to do. We will go next for the migration methods. So now we have covered the migration path, migration strategies. Now what we need to look at is the migration methods that we need to use. Now generally, as in Microsoft, from an SQL Server perspective, we have 5 general methods for the migration. We can consider backup and restore as the general approach, where you back up a database and restore it to another location. You can consider also attach and deattach. I usually prefer these two methods for small databases that have a small size. Now, other approaches like the manual schema rebuild, log shipping, and copy database wizard, these are all considered as another approach to go with, another method, to go with the migration. Now, in general sense, I do prefer the manual schema rebuild, log shipping, and copy database wizard from a perspective of large databases. We usually prefer them because you don't have a downtime, or you can minimize the downtime for doing a migration. So, for example, if you have something like an 8 hours maintenance window, and it takes you something like 12 hours to do a backup and a restore, so you will exceed the maintenance window and the server might stay down. However, what you can do is a log shipping. You can start the log shipping, and the log shipping, what it will do is that it will shift to the new direction, and the starting point could be your old server, and the end point could be your new server. So a log shipping is a nice way to handle, for example, a migration method. Now, each one of them has its own advantages and disadvantages, where you can go through with each one on the official documentation and make a decision. However, what we're trying to mention here is that these are the Microsoft out-of-the-box tools that are available for you. Now, there are other tools that could be considered as aid for your migration, as an aid to aid you through the migration. Something like, for example, if you consider Data Protection Manager or System Center or so on, but this is outside of SQL Server itself. Now, what I'm focusing about is the tools that you can use in SQL Server using the out-of-the-box tools. Our fourth perspective is the application reconfiguration. We need to look at the application reconfiguration from two angles. The first angle is that you need to consider not only the database that you're trying to migrate, you need to have a look at the application that's running that database. Because one way or another, you need to verify that application supports your migration path. So for example, if you're trying to migrate to SQL 2012 and the application only runs in SQL 2008, then the original vendor of the application, the provider, he needs to do some kind of work where he needs to upgrade his application as well. So don't just assume that whenever you start working on an application, it will automatically be supporting SQL Server, the newer version, or maybe the different configuration you're doing. Also, I would like to highlight something that we call an SQL Server compatibility level. So for example, you might have an application that runs on compatibility level 90, while SQL Server while the newer version might run on compatibility level 110, for example. Maybe the application itself doesn't support that compatibility level. So what you need to first do is to understand what kind of application you have and then start your migration. From another perspective, you can do some kind of practice where you build up something like an application supportability matrix. An application supportability matrix is a sheet. What you used to do is you build some kind of custom sheet. It could be using Excel, for example, where you categorize your applications. Now, what you do with that sheet is that you consider putting all the applications that you have and then start categorizing all the SQL Server instances, and the operating system also is an angle that you need to look at and check whether that application supports it or not. I would like to answer a question that has been asked by a friend, that what you can do with a system server on the side-by-side upgrade. I assume that you're talking about the System Center. Well, System Center itself, if I'm correct, it uses the DPM or Data Protection Manager. Now, Data Protection Manager can start by shifting your data and minimize your data time, because it uses something that we call a shadow copy, which somehow minimizes the effort needed or the time needed to shift the database from a location to another. But it only gives you the perspective for copying only, not for doing the migration itself. So this is, I hope that I tackled your question. Now, to take a look back at the application supportability matrix again, as you can see, we have multiple applications that are running on several servers with several instances and with different versions. What you need to focus about, it's not only that you need to consider SQL from a product perspective like 2005 or 2008. You also need to consider versions of SQL, like such as enterprise and a standard. Maybe your current starting point is a standard, is an enterprise point, and you're shifting to a standard. So there might be some kind of feature lost into that integration. Another thing that you need to consider is to define your original vendor or the owner of the application, because you need to contact him later on and ask whether he supports that operating system that you're trying to reach or that SQL Server that you're trying to reach. So for example, if his application doesn't support Windows 2012, for an example, and you only have an SQL Server 2012 installed and SQL Server installed on Windows Server 2012, then you need to consider also the operating system, the host system as well, which is some kind of issue. We need also to look at the migration backup, which is one of the tasks that we need to consider during a migration. First of all, you need to consider performing a backup before starting your migration. The thing that you need to notice that you need to do a backup for everything, including the system databases. The only system database that I might exclude from this is the CampDB because it's automatically generated. However, the other databases have a job as well. So you might need to consider backing up the databases themselves as well. We have two important points of backups that you need to consider. The first point of backup is the backup that you take at the beginning of the process. Before doing anything, you need to put a breakpoint and disconnect all users that are using that application and start your maintenance window and do that backup. Now, the other point of backup that's very important, it's done directly after the upgrade. So if you're planning to do an upgrade, after you have done the upgrade and you have that point, you need to take a backup. So you'll have two recovery backups. First one is before connecting the application and doing the configuration, first one is before doing the migration itself, and the second one is after doing the migration, especially if it's had an upgrade. What you need to do is before doing any additional configuration, take that backup so that you don't have to walk the whole way back if there is something, if some kind of error happens. We will also have to look at VLDBs. Now, to some perspective, VLDBs stand for very large databases. What we usually consider as a very large databases are the databases that hundreds of gigs. So if you consider that database that has hundreds of gigs or terabytes, you need to consider some aspects before going through your migration. So in general sense, these databases might need very large amount of storage that you might not have. So if you're trying, for example, to move a side by side, you need to consider the size of the data or the size of the disk that you need for moving that database as in a backup. Then you need also to consider the size that you need for the new server, for example, or where you want to move it. So this is the first thing that you need to consider in a VLDB. Another issue that you need to consider is that you need to know that your network, it could be a bottleneck for you. So if you're taking a backup from a location to another location, that bottleneck could be the network. So if the network is slow and you're trying to take a terabyte range of a backup, that will take a lot of time. So consider that as well as a bottleneck for your implementation. One more thing is that if you consider some kind of VLDBs that are considered as mission critical or high business impact, what happens usually with high business impact that you cannot put that application down for a long time, and maybe some of the application cannot go down at all. So you need to consider how to plan your backups and everything regarding the VLDBs and what kind of maintenance that you're going to go through. You also need to check the SLA level for that application. The SLA level is the service level application. That might be also an issue for you. Also, you need to consider that the upgrade with the maintenance window. You need to know when the customer has the maintenance window and when it's possible to start an upgrade for the VLDBs for a maintenance window. Maybe the time frame for that maintenance window could be something like 2 hours or 3 hours, and the backup itself might need something like 10 hours, for example. So what will you do if the maintenance window and that time overlaps? So one trick is that you can use something like a log shipping, where it can help you usually to tackle this task. This is just an example on some servers and application that might be considered a good nomination for VLDBs. Now, in general, since this is just a random data segment where I put in some numbers and I just to present it for you guys, but in some sense, some of these data could be considered as VLDBs and other could not be considered. Let me give you an explanation why we might exclude some of these items in the list as being a VLDB. Now, for example, some of the data that you can see might have a large log file. And whenever you need to consider taking a backup, if you took a full backup, you can consider destroying that log file because what you did is just you take a backup. So if you can really eliminate or truncate that log file, these data might be shrinking to a smaller level. Also, you need to consider some of the database tools that you use, like the DBCC check. The consistency check might help you to check whether there are issues in the database or not. So before going with your backup or going with your maintenance and the migration, just do a general maintenance in that database and the size might shrink. In other sense, you need to consider whether the application is a critical application or not. So from a perspective, whenever you're dealing with the VLDs, there are a few tricks that you need to consider to make the size smaller and to handle such a data size. In addition, we will go for what we call a migration tasks. In the migration task, we need to spend some time here to focus on what are the migration tasks that we need to consider. First of all, we have something that we call a pre-migration task. These tasks are usually very, very important to start working on before starting a migration. Now, these tasks are critical to be completed and to be considered to guarantee the success of your migration. First of all, let's consider rolling up the service packs and updates and hotfixes needed. Now, if we consider the migration path to SQL 2012, for example, SQL Server 2005 need to have Service Pack 4 installed. So before doing anything, you need to contact the vendor and check if he had installed Service Pack 4 on that server. In addition, you need to consider that some of the application might have an issue with the service pack. So some application might not support some of the fixes or some of that item. So you need to guarantee that you have covered that area with the application provider or the application vendor. In a different perspective, you need to run the DBCC check DB command. Now, the DBCC check command helps you to check that the database is in consistent state. Now, some of the databases might have some kind of errors that are there. These errors will be, if you move these databases with the errors, they will also be moved with that error. So you need to be careful that if there is an error on the old environment, don't expect that the new environment will fix it. It will not fix it. You need to be precise and run the DBCC check on all the databases. Now, the DBCC check itself needs to run on all the databases, not only on a one database or a two database. You need to consider that instance and look at it from a perspective and run the DBCC check on all the databases to make sure that all of them are consistent. Another issue is the backup. Now, as we mentioned earlier, you need to back up user databases and system databases. System databases are also important to consider because if you miss some kind of configuration that has been done on the system database, you need to consider some kind of recovery point. Some of these issues happen due to the fact that they missed some of the system database. Also, there is another thing to consider is to run the upgrade advisory tool. Now, SQL Server in general has what we call an advisory tool. Like, for example, SQL 2012, whenever you insert the media, you have something like that we call a feature path. In that feature path, you can find what we call an advisory tool. This advisory tool, what it does is that it runs on the old or the legacy version of SQL, and it generates a report that tells you what are the problems that need to be fixed before, after, and during a migration. So this report doesn't only consist from a database perspective. It runs on a different components such as reporting services, analysis services, and so on. So you must, first of all, before making your decision to proceed or not, you must use the upgrade advisory tool. Last thing is to check for best practices. Now, if you consider like building a new environment or moving to a new environment where you're going to plan for your migration, why don't you consider to go for a best practice? Now, of course, you can download the best practices tools where you can have a best practice analyzer go through your current implementation and give you the suggestions to improve. So in general sense, if you have done these prerequisites or the pre-migration tasks, you can guarantee that you have eliminated around 70 to 80% of the problems that might arise later on. Now, the most important thing is that people usually underestimate the effort needed to do a migration. And that's what caused some kind of trouble during that implementation. Now what we need to look at is the post-migration tasks. Also, you need to consider that there are some tasks that need to be done after the success of a migration. Now, these tasks are very important, and you need to consider the following. You need to consider that, first of all, after you do the migration and the migration is successful, you need to consider that you need to reconfigure your current applications that are connected to this database to the new database. Now, if you left them on the old database, they will continue running on that database, and none of your transactions will be reflected to the new migrated application. Another thing is you need to determine some kind of success criteria. So, for example, if you're working with other parties and you just move the database, you need to consider what's your success criteria. How can you determine that the upgrade is successful? Usually, some people determine that by giving some kind of period of time, like 3 days, 5 days, to test the application after the migration. And additionally, you can also go for a test environment. So before your migration, you can build your own test environment and do all the pre-migration tasks and so on, build it on that test environment, then verify that it's working correctly, and after that, proceed with the production environment. The last thing that you need to consider is the decommission and the uninstall. Now, after you've done your migration, maybe you're moving from an environment to a different environment, and you don't need that server anymore. But what happens usually is that you forget about that server or that machine, and you will have a bunch of machines there that nobody uses. Now, these are wasted resources that you need to consider to spend more time and decommission them as soon as possible, because they're consuming effort and they will be piling up and will increase the number of servers, which means that you will need more team to support them. Now, also consider that decommissioning these servers are very important for you, especially if you're not using them anymore. We will cover next the workloads, and what we can talk about is the workloads and how building a workloads. What we need to cover is that how to decide or how to build a certain workload. Now, in general sense, let me define a workload for you guys. The workload is some kind of logical grouping for applications or for servers in general sense. So, for example, if you're dealing with hundreds of databases that are scattered across hundreds of servers, what happens is that you cannot really tackle all these servers as in one shot and then send them back. What you need to do is to separate them into logical units, which we call the workload. Now, first of all, you need to agree on a certain criteria. The criteria, for example, I have given you here, there are many criteria that you can follow. There are nothing standard. What you need is just to provide them criteria. So, for example, a business impact for that application could be a criteria, like a low-level business impact or a medium business impact or a high business impact. The SLA itself could be a criteria, the service level agreement. The editions also of the SQL Server are a criteria as well. You can really mix and match multiple criteria. So in general sense, you can do more than one thing, and you can handle that in a way where you can build your criteria. Now, after you build your criteria and discuss it with the vendor or the customer that you're working with, you will have some kind of logical explanation for that criteria where you build, for example, multiple workloads. This is just an example for workload number 1, 2, and 3 regarding the business impact. So, for example, if you consider the application in workload number 2, there are medium business impact. That means that they're not highly critical and they're not really low important. They're just important, but maybe the customer don't want to do any investment in that part. So you need to consider that you separate them first of all logically. Then you need to understand what database follows under which workload and which application. So for example, if we took workload number 2 and application number 5, what we need to do is to understand how many databases falls under workload number 5. So in general sense, you will have a breakdown through the workloads and through that criteria. Now what workloads does for you, it helps you to build your migration plan. So first of all, there are a bunch of activities that we have already discussed, such as pre-post migration tasks. And now you have some kind of workloads where you have some kind of logical grouping for all the tasks that you need to do. In addition, if you added some kind of dates and measurement for these criteria and so on, what you will end up is building your own migration plan and to go through all the consideration we have mentioned earlier. Now let's go through the considerations where we need to take some kind of consideration that we might have missed or we haven't discussed through this presentation. Now, the first thing that you need to consider is what makes a successful migration for you. You need first to ask if you're working in a customer site or if you're working in a customer location, what makes it a successful migration for you? So maybe you have something in mind. Now, another thing is that you need to consider whether that you're going to do the testing of that applications or not. So after you move the database and migrate it or maybe do the upgrade, are you going to test that application? Or maybe that vendor or that customer might have a testers or a team of testers that need to do that job. Also, you need to define if you're building a test environment, as we mentioned earlier. If you're building a test environment, it's very important that you consider the amount and effort needed to build that test environment. Now, considering, for example, that you have some kind of VLDBs, very large databases, in terabytes of bytes, and you're building a test environment, so consider that these are replications of the size of the teras, so you will need more storage. So if you started with an environment like a production environment that has 2 terabytes, and you're planning to build, for example, a test environment with additional 2 terabytes, and you need to consider also some kind of place where to store your backups and so on. So you will end up with a huge amount of number of storage, might reach to 10 or 20 terabytes, therefore considering these amounts. Another thing that you need to consider and focus on is the downtime and maintenance windows. What happens with customers, usually they don't like to have a downtime. So these databases might be critically or mission critical. So they don't need them to go down. So some kind of consideration needs to happen there. For example, if you're working on a failover clustered environment, what you can do is to start your migration and upgrade on the first node or on the passive node, and then shift it down to the other node. Then you can proceed with the migration on the other node as well. So there are many techniques where you can handle such a scenario. Another thing that we mentioned earlier is the log shipping, where you can start and use log shipping and initiate it on the source server and put the destination server is the endpoint for your migration. So for example, if you start SQL 2005, you can start the log shipping on SQL 2005 and directly point it to the destination of SQL 2012. So it will do that job for you without having a downtime or minimizing the downtime for you at least. Now also what you need to consider is the different version of SQL Server. Now SQL Server by itself has different editions, such as Standard, Enterprise, Web, Data Center. And also you need to consider that different product has different editions. Like for example, if you consider SQL 2000, it used to have what we call a desktop engine. However, this is not available anymore and we replaced it for an Express, for example. That desktop engine is different than the Express version. So if you consider that you're going to shift it and work with it and everything will be done, no, just you need first to consider what kind of impact you have and what are the items that you're going to work with. From another perspective, we covered in this session the database and how you can migrate database in general sense. You need to consider that the database or SQL Server itself is considered for more components other than the database. These components are, for example, SQL Server reporting services, where you need to consider the migration of that component itself. it's not enough only to move the SQL database and consider everything will work fine. Maybe if you move that database and put it down, the SQL reporting services won't have the mapping for that database. Also, you need to consider other services that are running with that database, such as analysis services, where you might have considered moving an OLAP or the cubes that you might have, and you might need to move them. Maybe there is some kind of also compatibility issue between the newer and older version that you're doing an upgrade with. So these are another issues that you need to consider. And finally, you need to consider SQL Server integration services. In addition, there are customization and coding that you need to consider. Maybe that database or that SQL Server has more than just a database. It could have something like an SQL Server projects or a data tiers that are built using Visual Studio. Now, in general sense, these need to be considered as well. Maybe full text search or any customization that are built, data marks or so on. Just consider these facts before doing the migration so that you can have a better perspective on how to do so. Another thing to go through is the database security. Now, if your database is currently using some kind of encryption, like a TDE or something like that, what you need to focus about is that whenever you do a backup, you need also to back up the security keys and certificates that comes with that encryption. Because if you move it to that different location, what happens is you need to consider that these data are encrypted and they won't get decrypted. So be careful whenever you do a data migration. Be careful of the security part. An additional part that is not mentioned here is the collation. Now also what you need to consider is the collation as well. So whenever you do a database backup or a migration or so on, consider the source collation and the destination collation for these databases. Now, the collation in general sense is what translates some kind of a feature that are available for the database. Maybe the collation is set to a different language or a different encoding. Then you will end up with a useless database. So these are also an issue that you need to consider and work with. Another thing is to look at the operating systems. You need to look at the operating systems and compatibility levels. Now, the operating system might not affect the database directly. However, they might affect the application that are running these databases. So, for example, if you're trying to migrate an application that doesn't support a certain operating system and runs along with that database, maybe the customer will make the decision not to migrate or not to shift because his application doesn't support that. And finally, you need to consider what we call a migration plan. After this session, we have talked about a lot of factors and a lot of things that we consider. These things can be considered as an items for your migration plan. So you need to build a migration plan, including all the activities we mentioned here. These activities could be the pre-migration tasks, the post-migration tasks, and you can consider also the activities that you've done in the middle and consider the workloads. So all these factors themselves, when you put them together, they meet your migration plan. Now I will spend the next remaining time to tackle some of your questions if you have. I will also try to share with you guys a migration sheet so that you can see how to build a migration plan and how it works for you guys, just to give you a high level on how to build a migration plan. Another issue I would like to share with you guys is that we have a blog. This blog I have wrote, it has some kind of description on these activities. This blog can be considered also a starting point for you, where you can manage and see all the aspects we have discussed during this session. So this is another issue that you can go through. Okay, I have to share the URL. I will be sending you the URL of my blog, and I will include it. It's here you go. Here is the URL for the blog. I have a question from, hi, I'm migrating from Server 2003, SQL 2005 to SQL Server 2012. and Windows Server 2012. Are both on Hyper-V environment? Do I need any more backup aside from my VM backup and my DR? I will not decommission my old server until everything works. So the question goes here with a good angle. We need to consider, first of all, that you mentioned that you have a DR site. Now, first of all, other than taking the backup, you need to consider that you need to reconfigure the DR settings for you. So, for example, if you're doing a mirroring, the mirroring will not be transferred. So you need to focus on mirroring, log shipping, and so on for your DR setup. That's the first thing. Now, the Hyper-V, the backup from the VM itself, it could be sufficient, and that could be a good starting point for you because you can get back directly to that snapshot. So it could be a good place to do the backup. So it is sufficient, and I think that could work. But consider also if there is an encryption or anything else related, like a customization and so on, you need to back them separately. Okay, I have another question. Do you have any challenges which you face on VLDB database on real time? Let me tackle that question from a different angle. Now, whatever happens on a VLDBs and real time, what happens is that when you consider the migration, you need to consider the downtime for that application. So, for example, if you consider that's a real-time application that you're working with, and it's a VLDB. Now, let's say that the limit for your database or the operating system supports only 2 tera, and your data is growing more than that, and you're shifting to another operating system or another file system that doesn't support that growth. So what happens then is that you need to consider also what kind of operating system you're moving in and what kind of file system you need to move to. So this is, I think, we'll tackle that question. Okay, I have another question, which is how you migrate stored procedures 2008 to 2012 about the T-SQL syntax difference. Well, what happened is this question how to be tackled now. SQL Server 2008 runs in a compatibility level that could be compatibility level 90. And SQL 2012 run in a different compatibility level, which is compatibility level 110. Now, what you need to do is that there is a Microsoft official site where I can share with you later on that shows what kind of differences between different versions have. So this is also as in that question. What happened is that you need to consider what has been deprecated, for example, like in syntax and the T-SQL or the feature that you're using. So there might be some kind of difference between the compatibility level itself. Some maybe stored procedures or names that are used in that for stored procedure are different. Like I can, for example, remember some of them, but I will try to share with you the session. After the session, I will try to share with you the compatibility level and the difference between compatibility levels. We have another question. What to consider in the solution? You have VMware or virtualization environment also. Now, what happened is that in virtualized environment, like in VMware or Hyper-V, you have additional effort that you need to consider, but this goes outside the discussion of a migration. You need to look at it from a different perspective, which is consolidation. Now, there is a later session next month about consolidation. Now, this session directly handles that topic, and I can give you more information about that issue. But in general sense, virtualization is not really a bottleneck for the migration itself, because mainly your obstacles aren't with the virtualized environment, they're rather with the compatibility of the applications and the operating system that are running them. But for more information on that topic, I can tackle it within next month's session, which will be about consolidation. So I would like to thank you all for attending this session today, and please make sure to check the webcast series for more useful sessions. Hope you enjoyed this session today. Thank you.